Reading a forbidden book was once a crime punishable by death. This video uncovers the clandestine manuscripts that redefined the boundaries of human reason, texts so dangerous that authorities would burn them, and sometimes their authors too. You will discover the secret history of ideas that were too radical for their time, and how they secretly built the modern world. Why were simple philosophical questions considered such a threat to power? What was so alarming about a friar's experiments with light or a poet's journey through the afterlife? By the end, you will understand how these suppressed works challenged the very foundations of society and set the stage for everything we know today. What does it truly mean to have an idea that is powerful enough to be forbidden? That scriptorium was the front line of a silent war over knowledge. Here, in the quiet glow of candlelight, a monk's pen was a powerful weapon, but only if it copied the right words. Every line of text was scrutinized, every illustration checked for compliance. This meticulous process reveals the true anatomy of censorship. It was not a simple act of saying no. It was a sophisticated system designed to control the very architecture of human thought, long before any dangerous idea could reach the public. At the heart of this system was the Index of Prohibited Books, a formal list maintained by the Catholic Church. Imagine a catalogue of everything you were forbidden to read, think, or discuss. It was a legal and spiritual firewall, but the control did not stop at the monastery walls. It extended into the emerging universities, where the curriculum was carefully policed to ensure young minds were steered away from disruptive philosophies. The ultimate symbol of this suppression was the public book burning. These were not quiet disposals. They were grand spectacles held in town squares, meant to terrorize and intimidate. The crackling flames consuming parchment were a clear message. This is what happens to ideas that challenge the established order, so why go to such extremes? Why was a simple book seen as a threat comparable to an army? The ruling powers of the medieval world understood something profound. An unchallenged idea is a foundation of power. The divine right of kings, the absolute authority of the church, the rigid social hierarchy, all of these depended on a population that did not ask why. The written word, especially when it championed human reason, gave people the tools to do just that, to ask why, and to imagine a different world. This deep-seated fear of reason's power set the stage for an inevitable clash, one perfectly captured by the story of a single revolutionary poem. The Condemnation of 1277 was a thunderclap that silenced the intellectual life of Paris. Archbishop Etienne Tempier did not just ban a few books. He outlawed 219 specific ideas, creating a map of forbidden thought that every scholar was forced to navigate. The primary targets were the works of Aristotle and his brilliant Islamic interpreter, Averroes, whose writings had recently surged into Europe, offering a complete system for understanding the natural world through reason and observation. To the Archbishop, this was not philosophy. It was a contagion. The fear was that if you could explain the movement of the stars or the nature of the soul using pure logic, what need was there for divine revelation? The authority of the Church itself seemed to be at stake, so the ban was put in place, a desperate attempt to build a wall between faith and reason. But a curious thing happened. The condemnation did not end philosophical inquiry. It forced it underground and made it more creative. When the direct path to Aristotle was blocked, thinkers had to find new, more subtle routes. They could not openly teach that the world was eternal, as Aristotle claimed, so they had to formulate new arguments about creation. They were forbidden from exploring certain logical conclusions about the soul, so they developed more nuanced concepts of intellect and will. This censorship, intended to stifle, instead acted as a strange kind of fertilizer. It pushed the brightest minds of the generation to ask tougher questions and to build stronger, more independent frameworks for their ideas. They began to separate, just slightly, the domains of science and theology, creating a space where human reason could operate without immediately challenging divine truth. This first great clash did not resolve the tension between faith and reason. It simply established the battlefield, a conflict over knowledge that would be fought in the pages of many forbidden books to come. The heavens presented a different kind of danger. While philosophers debated the soul, astronomers were mapping a sky that seemed to whisper secrets about human destiny. At the center of this celestial tension was a mysterious book known as the Speculum Astronomiae, the Mirror of Astronomy. Its author remains a shadow, though many pointed to the great scholar Albertus Magnus. This was not a book of simple stargazing. It was a desperate attempt to draw a line in the sand between what was safe to know and what could get you condemned. The text made a critical, dangerous distinction. On one side was natural astrology, the study of how the stars might influence tides, weather, and the growth of plants. This was often tolerated. On the other was judicial astrology, the art of predicting the fate of kings, the outcomes of wars, and the course of individual lives based on planetary movements. This was forbidden knowledge. To claim the stars dictated human actions challenged the core Christian doctrines of free will and divine providence. It suggested that God's plan could be read in the constellations, making the church itself almost unnecessary. Imagine the private turmoil of a scholar in his cloistered study, a single candle illuminating a handwritten copy of the speculum. His finger traces a chart of planetary alignments. He feels the pull of a magnificent cosmic order, a universe governed by intricate, knowable laws. But with that wonder comes a chill of fear. Is his curiosity a pursuit of divine harmony, or is it a descent into heresy? The book itself was his guide, a manual for walking that razor's edge. It systematized this dangerous knowledge, creating a catalogue of which astrological texts were acceptable and which were not. It was a paradox, a book about forbidden books, trying to build a safe container for an explosive idea. The Speculum Astronomiae was never officially placed on the index, but it existed in a perpetual gray zone. It represented the medieval mind's deepest conflict, a burning fascination with the natural world constantly checked by the rigid walls of religious orthodoxy. The stars were a text written in light, and some believed God intended for humanity to read it. But every time a scholar looked up, he had to ask himself, how much of this celestial language am I actually allowed to understand? This struggle to grasp the mechanics of the cosmos, however risky, was a necessary step. It paved the way for an even more profound question, one that would be asked not of the stars, but of the very nature of reality itself. A king's most dangerous weapon was not his army, but a book of advice he had to keep hidden. In the shadowy corridors of medieval power, one text redefined the very essence of rulership, a work known as the Secret of Secrets. Purportedly a private letter from the philosopher Aristotle to his most famous student, Alexander the Great, this was no ordinary historical document. It was a mirror for princes, a comprehensive guide that blended sober political strategy with the tantalizing secrets of alchemy, astrology, and medicine. Think of a ruler like Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, a man of immense intellect and ambition, poring over a clandestine copy by candlelight. He was not seeking theological debate. He was searching for practical wisdom on how to consolidate his empire. maintain his health through esoteric elixirs, and perhaps even decipher the hidden movements of the stars to outmaneuver his rivals. The Church viewed this blend of pragmatic statecraft and occult science with deep suspicion. While the secret of secrets was not always explicitly named on the official index, its contents constantly danced on the edge of heresy. Its advice on using astrology to determine the most auspicious time for a coronation or a battle directly challenged the doctrine that God alone controlled such outcomes. Its passages on natural magic and alchemy ventured into a realm the authorities labeled superstitious and dangerous, yet its immense popularity among Europe's elite reveals a profound truth. There was a ravenous hunger for knowledge that the sanctioned universities and churches simply could not satisfy. This book offered power, plain and simple. It was a toolkit for worldly success, and its forbidden nature only made it more attractive to those who already held the reins of power. This pursuit of prohibited knowledge for practical gain was not confined to kings and emperors. The very same impulse was driving a quiet, methodological revolution in the way people understood the natural world, a revolution that would find its ultimate expression in the work of a single, determined friar. Roger Bacon saw a world trapped in a prison of words. While scholars in Paris debated the fine points of ancient texts, this Franciscan friar was in his Oxford cell, grinding lenses to study the properties of light. He was not interested in winning an argument through clever rhetoric. He believed that to understand the world, you had to interrogate it directly, to force nature to reveal its secrets through experiment. His monumental work, the Opus Majus, was a desperate plea sent to the Pope himself. It was a blueprint for intellectual revolution, urging a complete overhaul of learning to rest upon three new pillars: mathematics, the study of languages, and most dangerously, experimental science. He called this method Scientia Experimentalis, a phrase that carried a quiet but profound threat. It proposed that a single, verifiable observation could overturn 1,000 years of accepted authority. Imagine the scandal of such a thought. A humble friar with a carefully constructed experiment could, in principle, prove a revered ancient philosopher like Aristotle wrong. This struck at the very foundation of medieval education, which was built on the meticulous analysis and disputation of authoritative texts, not on testing the physical world. Bacon's vision was breathtaking in its scope. He wrote of flying machines, of horseless carriages, of optical devices that could make distant objects appear near. He was mapping the future, but to the guardians of the present, this was not brilliance. It was insubordination. His own Franciscan order eventually saw his ideas as too disruptive, too unpredictable. They imprisoned him for his dangerous doctrines, and his writings were suppressed for generations. His persecution sent a chillingly clear message. The established powers were not just afraid of what people thought, but of how they thought. A new method of inquiry, one that placed human experience and direct evidence above received wisdom, was perhaps the most forbidden idea of all. This conflict between authority and evidence would not remain confined to the quiet of a friar's cell. It was about to erupt into the public sphere, challenging the most deeply held beliefs about the universe and humanity's place within it. Authority does not come from God. It comes from the consent of the governed. This was the explosive core of Marsilius of Padua's Defensor Pacis, a book that did not just cross a line, it erased the line entirely. Written in 1324, this text launched a direct assault on the very pillars of medieval power. Marsilius argued with chilling clarity that the only legitimate source of political authority was the people themselves, the whole body of citizens. He insisted the Church should have no role in temporal government, no power to appoint kings, no right to levy taxes. and certainly no authority to excommunicate rulers who defied the Pope. This was not a subtle philosophical tweak. It was a call for a complete inversion of the world as everyone knew it. The papal court in Avignon reacted with fury. To them, this was not a political treatise. It was a declaration of war. The book was condemned as heretical within a year, and Marsilius was forced to flee, living out his days under the protection of the very emperor the Pope had excommunicated. The Defensor Pacis became a ghost, a forbidden text whispered about in hushed tones, yet its ideas were immortal. It provided a philosophical blueprint for a state that could exist independently of religious control, planting the early seeds for the democratic revolutions that would transform the world centuries later. Its banning proved that the concept of popular sovereignty was perhaps the most dangerous idea of all, because it turned subjects into citizens. This political earthquake, which sought to dismantle hierarchical power from the top down, was happening at the very same time as another, even more intimate revolution. Another forbidden book was about to challenge divine authority not in the halls of government, but within the human soul itself. A single word could now be a death sentence, and that word was God, spoken not in Latin but in English. This was the profound danger of John Wycliffe's Bible. For the first time, the foundational text of the faith was deliberately translated from the official Latin Vulgate into the common tongue of the people during the 1380s. Before this act, the scriptures were a locked garden, and only the ordained clergy held the key. The Latin Mass was a beautiful, mysterious ritual, its meaning opaque to the farmer, the blacksmith, and the housewife. Wycliffe and his followers, known as Lollards, believed every person had the right to access God's word directly. They undertook a monumental task, painstakingly copying his English translation by hand, creating forbidden manuscripts that circulated in secret. Picture a secluded cottage in an English village after dark. A small group gathers, their faces illuminated by a single candle. One person, their voice barely a whisper, reads from a carefully hidden book. The words are familiar, yet utterly new. They are hearing the story of creation, the Psalms, the teachings of Jesus, in the same language they used to speak to their children and bargain at the market. In that moment, the entire hierarchy of the church, the need for a priestly intermediary, seemed to vanish. The authority was no longer vested in a distant institution, but in the text itself and in the individual's relationship with it. The church authorities understood the threat immediately. This was not just about language, it was about power. They argued with genuine fear that untrained minds would misinterpret the complex scriptures, leading to error, schism, and chaos. How could a common laborer possibly understand the nuanced theology that took scholars a lifetime to master? The real, unspoken fear was different. If people could read the Bible for themselves, they might notice discrepancies between the simple teachings of Christ and the wealth and political power of the medieval church. They might start to ask why they needed a pope at all. The establishment responded with brutal force. The constitutions of Oxford in 1408 made it a crime to translate any part of the Bible into English or to read such a translation without the approval of a bishop. The punishment for possessing a Wycliffe Bible was severe, often death by burning. The hatred for this idea was so intense that it pursued Wycliffe beyond the grave. He died of a stroke, but decades later, the church ordered his body exhumed. His bones were burned and his ashes were scattered in a river, a symbolic attempt to utterly erase his memory and his work from the earth. But you cannot burn an idea. The river that carried his ashes flowed to the sea, and his translated words had already taken root in the hearts of his followers. This battle over a book was the ultimate act of democratizing knowledge, asserting that divine truth was not the property of a privileged class, but the birthright of every listening soul. This English rebellion of the spirit, however, was about to find its most dramatic and tragic champion on the continent, a man who would take Wycliffe's spark and turn it into an inferno. The ashes of Wycliffe had barely cooled when a new voice rose from Bohemia, echoing the same dangerous truths. Jan Hus, a priest in Prague, began to preach from Wycliffe's forbidden books, but he did more than just repeat them. He forged them into a weapon. In his own explosive text to Ecclesia on the Church, he made a declaration that shattered 1,000 years of tradition. He argued that the true Church was not the Pope, the cardinals, or the vast clerical bureaucracy. It was the entire community of the faithful, the living body of all believers, with Christ himself as its only head. This single idea, simple and profound, pulled the rug out from under the entire medieval power structure. If the Pope was not the head of the Church, then his decrees, his taxes, and his power to excommunicate were all a fraudulent illusion. Hus took this message directly to the people, preaching in the vibrant Czech language of the streets and marketplaces, not the insulated Latin of the elite. Imagine the energy in a Prague town square, packed with merchants, artisans, and peasants, all hearing the scriptures and the call for reform in their own tongue for the very first time. It was a spiritual and national awakening, a fire that the authorities could not ignore. His most direct confrontation was over the sale of indulgences, where the Church offered forgiveness of sins for a cash payment. Hus saw this not as piety, but as a corrupt marketplace trading on the fears of the poor. The establishment's response was a trap disguised as a dialogue. He was summoned to the Great Council of Constance, given a promise of safe conduct to defend his views, but upon his arrival, the promise was broken. He was arrested, thrown into a dungeon, and put on trial for heresy. The central piece of evidence against him was his own book, De Ecclesia. He was given a simple choice: recant his writings and life, or hold fast to his conscience and die. He refused to deny what he believed to be the truth. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was led to the stake. As the flames climbed, the authorities made a final, symbolic effort to destroy him. They threw his books into the fire with him, hoping to consume both the man and his message in the same purifying blaze. But the opposite happened. His martyrdom did not extinguish his ideas, it baptized them in fire. The outrage in Bohemia ignited the Hussite Wars, a series of brutal conflicts where his followers took up arms to defend their right to believe as he had taught. A forbidden book had not just sparked a revolution, it had raised an army. The death of Hus demonstrated with terrifying clarity that the most dangerous ideas were not just about how to think, but about how to live and for whom to live. This brutal suppression of a religious reformer set a grim precedent, one that would soon be applied to a very different kind of thinker, someone whose forbidden questions were aimed not at the Church, but at the very fabric of the cosmos. Meister Eckhart spoke of God in a language of fire and intimacy that terrified the Church authorities. A German Dominican mystic of the early 1400s, he did not write political manifestos or challenge astronomical models. His rebellion was far more subtle and for that reason perhaps more dangerous. It happened in the silent, uncharted territory of the human soul. His sermons, delivered in the common German tongue, explored a path to God that required no priest, no sacrament, no ritual. He spoke of the birth of God in the soul, a moment of profound interior union where the individual ego fell away and the divine essence shone through. He called this meeting place the ground of the soul, a spark of the uncreated light within every person. Imagine the quiet revolution of a simple craftsman hearing these words for the first time. In the dim light of a private home, listening as a friend reads from a forbidden manuscript, he feels a sense of the divine that is immediate and personal. It is a connection that flows directly into his heart, bypassing the entire majestic, intimidating structure of the medieval church. This was the core of the heresy. Eckhart's mysticism did not attack the church from the outside. It proposed a path that made the institution seem almost irrelevant. If every person could find God in the ground of their own being, what was the purpose of the vast clerical machine? Why were confessionals and papal decrees necessary if the ultimate truth could be discovered in the silence of one's own room? After his death, the Church moved swiftly to contain this spiritual wildfire. 28 of his propositions were formally condemned. The authorities understood that a faith based on direct, unmediated experience was impossible to control. It was a faith of anarchic potential, where a humble peasant woman could claim a spiritual knowledge that rivaled that of a cardinal. Eckhart's condemnation marked a crucial boundary. It was permissible to have a devout faith, but that faith had to be channeled through the approved structures. Any attempt to reach for the divine on one's own terms was a threat to the very economy of salvation. This internal journey into the soul's deepest mysteries represented one pole of forbidden knowledge. It was a path of interiority, of turning inward to find the ultimate truth. But the human desire to understand and control the hidden forces of the universe could also turn outward, toward the material world itself, leading to a form of knowledge so dangerous it was branded not just as heresy, but as magic. The Picatrix offered a power far beyond simple stargazing. This Latin translation of an Arabic manual for astral magic was a step-by-step guide for bending the cosmos to your will. It taught its readers how to capture the specific energies of planets like Saturn or Mars, infusing that power into talismans carved at precise astrological moments. Think of a scholar not in a university but in a locked chamber at midnight. The air is thick with the smoke of rare incense as he follows the book's intricate diagrams, inscribing a ring with the symbol of Venus. He is not praying for favor, he is attempting to engineer it, to force the celestial forces to grant him love, health, or victory. This was the ultimate transgression. The Church taught that the heavens declared the glory of God, but the Picatrix treated them as a vast reservoir of raw, manipulatable energy. To the authorities, this was not science or philosophy. It was a direct pact with demons, as the planetary spirits were seen as fallen angels in disguise. Practicing its rituals was an express ticket to the stake, condemned as both heresy and witchcraft. The book represented the final, most audacious leap of forbidden reason. It was not enough to understand the universe's laws. The human mind now sought to become its co-author, to seize the levers of cosmic influence and command the very forces that governed reality. This hunger to dominate nature through hidden knowledge found its parallel in the dark, smoky laboratories of the alchemist, where the goal was not just to understand matter, but to perfect it. The alchemist's workshop was a sanctuary of smoke and shadow, where the scent of sulfur and mercury hung heavy in the air. Here, amid the bubbling alembics and glowing furnaces, practitioners pursued the ultimate forbidden secret, the power of transmutation. This was the core of alchemy, a practice balanced precariously between sanctioned proto-science and outright heresy. While some texts on metallurgy or medicine were tolerated, those that promised the creation of the philosopher's stone were viewed with the deepest suspicion. This legendary substance was said to do two impossible things: transform base lead into pure gold, and grant the gift of eternal life through the elixir of life. A manuscript like the Rosary of the Philosophers did not offer straightforward recipes. Its pages were filled with coded language and enigmatic illustrations, dragons swallowing their own tails, a king and queen in mystical union, all pointing toward a hidden spiritual and material process. For the alchemist hunched over his crucible, the work was a profound act of devotion. He was not merely trying to make gold. he was attempting to participate in the redemption of the material world itself, to accelerate nature's slow journey toward perfection. This was the true threat the Church perceived. If a human being could perfect metal, could he not also perfect his own soul? The quest for the philosopher's stone was a direct challenge to the divine order, a claim that humanity could enact its own salvation through knowledge and labor, bypassing the need for grace. The economic danger of creating artificial gold was a tangible fear for kings and popes, but the theological danger was far greater. It was the ultimate expression of forbidden reason, a belief that the secrets of creation were not mysteries to be accepted on faith, but puzzles to be solved by human intellect and perseverance. This intense, material focus on perfecting the physical world presents a fascinating contrast to our final forbidden book, a text that dared to question the very nature of God and the universe from a perspective of pure logic, pushing human reason to its absolute limit. A book that sought to bridge the gap between God and logic was condemned to the flames. Moses Maimonides wrote the guide for the perplexed in the late 12th century, not as an attack on faith, but as a rescue mission for the intelligent believer. He aimed to reconcile the rigorous philosophy of Aristotle with the sacred texts of Judaism, addressing the deep confusion of any thoughtful person who saw contradictions between Scripture and the emerging scientific worldview. For a scholar wrestling with his beliefs, the guide was a lifeline. It offered a way to read biblical stories not as literal accounts, but as profound allegories designed to convey spiritual truths to a less sophisticated audience. Maimonides argued that where reason, properly applied, reached a firm conclusion about the natural world, Scripture must be interpreted to align with that discovery. This was a breathtakingly dangerous proposition. It placed human intellect on the bench next to divine revelation as a tool for understanding truth. The authorities, both Jewish and later Christian, saw the immediate peril. If you could reinterpret God's word to fit the latest philosophical fashion, then the eternal, unchanging nature of holy text began to crumble. Faith was being subordinated to the frail and fallible machinery of human logic. This fear culminated in the public burning of the Guide in Paris in 1232, a dramatic attempt to extinguish its powerful synthesis, yet the ideas could not be contained. The very scholastics who condemned the book, like Thomas Aquinas, secretly absorbed its methods, creating their own intricate systems to harmonize faith and reason. The Guide for the Perplexed represents the most profound and perilous frontier of forbidden knowledge, the attempt to build a single, unified understanding of existence that satisfies both the heart's devotion and the mind's relentless questions. This philosophical balancing act within one tradition set the stage for a direct and brutal assault on the core of another. The quietest revolution often begins with a single manuscript pulled from a dusty monastery shelf. In 1417, the book hunter Poggio Bracciolini unearthed a complete copy of a poem thought lost for over 1,000 years, Lucretius de Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. This was no simple archaeological find. It was a philosophical bomb wrapped in the elegant Latin verse of the 1st century before Christ, and its rediscovery sent shockwaves through the very foundations of Renaissance thought. Lucretius presented a universe of breathtaking, terrifying simplicity. Everything in existence, from the human soul to the distant stars, was composed of invisible, indestructible particles he called atoms, falling and swerving through an infinite void. There were no creator gods, no divine plan, and no afterlife. The cosmos was a product of chance and immutable physical laws, and the highest human purpose was not salvation, but the pursuit of pleasure, defined as a life free from physical pain and mental fear. For a scholar raised on the certainty of divine judgment and the promise of eternal life, reading these words was like stepping into an alien world. the soul was mortal, and death was simply a return to atoms, a final and total release. This ancient Epicurean philosophy was a direct assault on the ascetic ideals of medieval Christianity, which valued suffering, prayer, and the rejection of worldly comforts as a path to God. How could a society built on the fear of hell and the hope of heaven process a text that declared both to be fantasies? The Church never formally placed de rerum natura on the index, likely because its pagan origins made its heresies too obvious to require an official ban. Instead, its danger was more insidious. It offered a complete, coherent, and beautiful alternative to the Christian worldview, a system where human reason alone could explain the cosmos and define a moral life. Intellectuals had to engage with its ideas secretly, praising its literary genius while quietly absorbing its radical materialism. They marveled at its descriptions of lightning, magnetism, and disease as natural phenomena, not divine interventions. The poem's return forced a fundamental re-evaluation of reality itself, suggesting that the universe was not a moral stage for a divine drama, but a vast, impersonal machine. This classical challenge to the medieval cosmos did more than just question the afterlife. It invited a new way of looking at the world right here and now, a perspective that would quietly prepare the ground for modern science. And as this new, mechanical universe took shape in the minds of thinkers, the next logical question became terrifyingly clear. If the heavens were just a clockwork of atoms, then who was really in charge of time? A perfect mathematical cage was being built for the heavens themselves. The Alfonsine Tables, compiled under the patronage of King Alfonso X of Castile in the 13th century, offered an astonishingly precise roadmap of the cosmos. For generations, astronomers and astrologers relied on these complex calculations to predict planetary positions and the timing of eclipses with a new level of accuracy. Yet this very precision created a profound intellectual trap. The entire system was built upon Ptolemy's geocentric model, a beautiful but desperate mathematical fiction. To make the observed looping paths of the planets fit the unwavering belief that the Earth stood still at the center of creation, the model required a dizzying array of circles within circles, known as epicycles and deferents. The tables were a masterpiece of calculation, but they described a universe that did not actually exist. Imagine a scholar, quill in hand, carefully checking the tables against his own nightly observations. He sees it a tiny but persistent error. Mars is not quite where the tables say it should be. At first, he assumes a mistake in his own work. He checks and rechecks his figures. But the discrepancy remains, a faint but undeniable glitch in the celestial machinery. This was the moment of true danger. The tables themselves were not forbidden. They were, in fact, an essential tool. The heresy began in the quiet of the scholar's own mind, in the forbidden thought that the glitch was not his error but the model's. To question the perfection of the Alfonsine Tables was to question the entire cosmic order, an order that placed humanity at the center of a divine creation and was supported by the full weight of scriptural authority. The tables represented the ultimate forbidden frontier, not for what they contained, but for the revolutionary conclusions their tiny flaws could inspire. They were a locked door, and the key was simply the courage to trust observation over authority. This slow, meticulous cracking of the celestial sphere, driven by mathematical discrepancies, presented a coldly rational challenge to the universe. It stood in stark contrast to another forbidden book that approached the divine not through calculation, but through a deeply personal and terrifying journey into the realms beyond death. Dante Alighieri placed a pope in hell. His Divine Comedy, a pillar of world literature, began its life as an act of profound and dangerous insubordination. Written not in the formal Latin of the scholars but in the vibrant, living Italian of the streets, the poem was designed to be understood by everyone, from the merchant to the mason. And within its meticulously crafted realms of the afterlife, Dante enacted a stunning literary judgment, damning the most powerful men of his age for their corruption. Readers in the 1400s would have felt a jolt of recognition and fear upon finding Pope Boniface VIII, who had died only a few years before Dante finished his work, assigned to the eighth circle of hell, his body trapped headfirst in a burning rock, his feet aflame as punishment for the sin of simony, the buying and selling of church offices. This was not a vague allegory. It was a specific public shaming of the highest authority in Christendom. The genius of Dante's rebellion was its protective camouflage. He wrapped his scathing political and theological critiques in the impeccable clothing of orthodox Catholic doctrine. The poem's entire structure affirmed the reality of hell, purgatory, and heaven. Its guide was the revered Roman poet Virgil. Its ultimate vision was of God. By working within this accepted framework, Dante gained the artistic license to say the unsayable. He used the eternal fate of souls to comment on the temporal crimes of the powerful, turning a spiritual epic into a biting political satire. He did not just criticize the church, he put it on trial before the court of public opinion, and he handed down the verdict himself. This act demonstrated a new kind of power, the power of art to challenge authority from within. A poet with a quill could accomplish what an army sometimes could not, permanently staining the reputation of a pope and questioning the very morality of an institution that claimed divine sanction. By writing in the vernacular, Dante ensured this dangerous judgment would not be confined to elite libraries, but would circulate widely, seeding critical thoughts in the minds of the common people. He proved that the most effective attacks on power are often not frontal assaults, but stories that capture the imagination and refuse to let go. This artistic insurrection, focused on the hierarchy of the church and state, naturally prompts a question about the foundation of that entire structure. If a poet could rearrange the moral order of the afterlife, what would happen if someone tried to redesign the very blueprint of society itself? A rosebud could conceal a revolution as dangerous as any philosophical treatise. The Romance of the Rose began as a charming allegory of courtly love, a knight's quest to win a single, precious rose within a guarded garden. But decades later, a new writer, Jean de Meun, took up the story and transformed it into something entirely different. His continuation was a sprawling, satirical epic that used the quest for the rose as a thin veil for a ruthless dissection of medieval society. He turned the garden walls into a stage for characters like Reason and False, seeming to deliver long, biting speeches that mocked the hypocrisy of the clergy, the vanity of the nobility, and the very conventions of romantic love itself. The most explosive passages dealt with sexuality and the nature of women with a startling frankness that shocked its vast audience. This was not a private philosophical text for scholars. It was a popular sensation, read aloud in royal courts and wealthy homes, and its ideas seeped into public consciousness like rain into soil. Then, a voice rose in direct opposition. The poet Christine de Pizan, one of the first professional female writers in Europe, publicly condemned the work for its blatant misogyny. She saw Jean de Meun's portrayal of women as deceitful and predatory, a poisonous caricature that corrupted the minds of its readers. Her protest ignited the Querelle de la Rose, the Quarrel of the Rose, a fierce literary debate conducted through letters and pamphlets. For the first time, a woman was leading a public charge against a foundational text of the literary canon, arguing that its ideas about human nature were not just offensive, but intellectually and morally bankrupt. The Romance of the Rose was never officially placed on the index of prohibited books. but its status was constantly contested. The real censorship happened in the court of public opinion, in the heated arguments between those who saw its satire as liberating truth and those who saw it as slanderous and corrupting. This battle proved that the boundaries of human reason were not just about God and cosmos, but about the most intimate human relations, about love, power, and gender. Controlling the narrative of desire was another way to control the architecture of society itself. This literary war over the nature of an ideal society, fought with allegory and accusation, was a precursor to a much more direct and radical proposal, one that would try to design a perfect world from the ground up. Christine de Pizan did not just write a defense, she built a fortress for the female mind. Her Book of the City of Ladies, completed in 1405, was a direct and brilliant counterattack against the poisonous ideas about women she saw in popular works like The Romance of the Rose. She envisioned a magnificent, allegorical city, its foundations laid on reason, its walls built by righteousness, and its houses constructed by justice. This was no mere metaphor, it was a new intellectual homeland populated entirely by the great and virtuous women of history and mythology. Think of a noblewoman in her private chamber, unrolling a precious manuscript. For the first time in her life, she is reading a book that does not depict her as a deceitful temptress or an intellectually inferior being. Instead, she finds a glorious lineage of queens, warriors, inventors, and scholars, all of her own sex. She learns of the Roman hydrologist who engineered an aqueduct, the Greek painter celebrated for her realism, the prophetesses and poets who shaped civilizations. Each story is a stone in the city's wall, a definitive rebuttal to the casual slander of women that passed for common wisdom. De Pizan's method was as radical as her message. She did not scream in outrage, she argued with devastating logic. She used the very tools of the male scholarly tradition, historical evidence and philosophical debate, to dismantle the prejudices of her male contemporaries. She directly challenged the authority of Aristotle himself, whose biological theories were used to justify female inferiority. How could women be naturally foolish, she asked, when history is filled with examples of their wisdom and capability? How could they be morally weak when so many female saints and martyrs displayed unwavering fortitude? She even turned scripture to her purpose, arguing that if God found woman worthy to be the mother of his son, then her sex could not be inherently flawed. This was a forbidden use of reason, not against the Church, but against the deep-seated social hierarchy that the Church often reinforced. Her book was never burned, but its ideas were a quiet earthquake. It asserted that women were rational beings, fully capable of intellectual and moral excellence, and therefore deserved education and respect. By redefining the capabilities of women, Christine de Pizan was fundamentally redefining who was allowed to participate in the grand conversation of human reason. This profound challenge to the social order, based on logical argument and historical proof, mirrors another radical text that took aim at the very economic foundations of that same society. A merchant's soul could be damned by a simple ledger entry. The sin of usury, the charging of interest on a loan, was condemned by the medieval church as a violation of divine and natural law. The argument drawn from Aristotle and Scripture was that money itself was sterile, a dead thing. A piece of gold could no more give birth to another piece of gold than a stone could give birth to a stone. To demand interest was to make money breed, an unnatural act that profited from time itself, which belonged only to God. This was not a minor ethical guideline. It was a cornerstone of the entire moral economy, a system designed to prevent the exploitation of the poor and maintain a static, orderly society. Yet in the bustling port cities of Italy and the market towns of Flanders, this doctrine was crumbling under the weight of its own impossibility. Imagine a wealthy merchant in Florence, a devout man, who wishes to finance a trading voyage to Alexandria. A fellow merchant needs a loan to purchase spices that will be sold for a great profit months later. The lender risks his entire capital, for the ship could sink or be seized by pirates. If he cannot share in the potential profit through interest, why would he ever take that risk? The entire engine of commerce would grind to a halt. This created an unbearable tension between the demands of faith and the necessities of business. Theologians and canon lawyers, pressed by these practical realities, began to perform incredible intellectual gymnastics to justify what was in essence interest. They devised complex contracts called contractus trinus that masked interest payments as shared risk or rental fees or insurance premiums. These were legal fictions and everyone knew it. A writer who openly defended usury, however, was treading on the most dangerous ground. He was not just proposing an economic policy. He was using human reason to argue against a law that was believed to have come directly from God. To claim that economic necessity could override divine commandment was to challenge the very hierarchy of truth. It suggested that the messy, material world of human affairs might have its own logic, a logic that could sometimes supersede the abstract ideals of theology. This was a heresy of practice, a rebellion born in the counting house rather than the university. The slow, grudging acceptance of interest-bearing loans, driven by the relentless force of commerce, marked a profound shift. It was the moment the modern economy began to break free from the grip of medieval dogma, proving that even the most sacred doctrines could not forever hold back the tide of human enterprise. This collision between sacred law and worldly need forced a deeper, more intimate question. If the rules governing a merchant's ledger could be questioned, then what about the rules governing a person's most direct relationship with God? The most dangerous revolution begins not with a protest but with a prayer. Thomas à Kempis' The Imitation of Christ, written in the early 15th century, stands as one of the most beloved and widely circulated Christian books in history, yet its gentle prose conceals a quiet seismic shift. Its focus is relentlessly internal, a guide to cultivating a personal, intimate friendship with Jesus through humility, self-denial, and constant meditation. A craftsman or a merchant reading its pages would find a path to holiness that unfolded within the silence of his own heart, a journey that required no grand cathedral, no elaborate ritual, and remarkably little mention of the institutional church or its clergy. This was the essence of the devotio moderna, the modern devotion. It was perfectly orthodox, never banned, and in fact championed by many within the church. But its power was subversive. By placing ultimate spiritual authority in the individual conscience and its direct relationship with Christ, it subtly relocated the center of gravity for the entire Christian life. The Church and its sacraments were not rejected, but they were repositioned, becoming supports for a faith that was now fundamentally personal and interior. This massive, silent redirection of piety empowered millions of ordinary believers. It taught them that they could hold a profound spiritual authority within themselves, a truth that would, within a century, provide the fertile emotional and intellectual soil for the Reformation's more confrontational challenge. The Imitation of Christ proves that the most transformative ideas are not always those that are violently suppressed, but sometimes those that are so warmly embraced they reshape the world from the inside out. This gentle inward turn, however, had a radical and dangerous counterpart, a text that would take this logic to its heretical extreme. A divine human has no need for priests, popes, or prayer. This was the terrifying conclusion of the Brethren of the Free Spirit, a radical underground movement that pushed medieval mysticism to its absolute limit. From the 13th century onward, their secret teachings circulated through Europe, passed in whispers and through clandestine manuscripts that the Church hunted with a special fury. Their core belief was as simple as it was subversive. They taught that a person could achieve such a state of spiritual perfection in this life that their own will would completely merge with the divine will. In this union, they became, in essence, God, and if you were God, you could not sin. All your actions, no matter how they appeared to the outside world, were by definition holy. The entire moral and legal structure of Christendom, from the 10 Commandments to the authority of the local priest, simply melted away for the truly perfected individual. Picture a secluded forest clearing at dusk. A small group gathers not around a fire, but around a single hand-copied booklet. The reader's voice is low and fervent as he shares the words. He speaks of a freedom beyond any earthly law, a state where the soul is so united with God that the concepts of heaven and hell lose all meaning. For a peasant or artisan whose entire life was defined by duty, hierarchy, and the fear of damnation, this message was an intoxicating liberation. It was a spiritual anarchy that promised ultimate authority to the self alone. The church authorities reacted with predictable horror. This was not just another heresy. It was the annihilation of the very idea of heresy, for it recognized no external judge. If every person could become God, then the church itself was rendered obsolete, a pointless intermediary for a connection that happened directly within the human soul. The persecution was merciless. Followers of the free spirit were tracked down, their manuscripts burned, and they themselves were often burned at the stake. The movement was driven so deep underground that almost none of their original writings survive. We know of their beliefs almost entirely from the condemnations written by their enemies, who were desperate to erase this most dangerous idea of all, that the boundary between the human and the divine was an illusion. The heresy of the free spirit represents the final, logical extreme of the inward turn, a path where human experience and reason claimed not just to understand God, but to be God. This ultimate claim of spiritual autonomy forces us to confront a final, fundamental question. If the self can become divine, what power then resides in the very words we use to describe that transformation? A desperate student kneels in a flickering circle of candlelight, his eyes fixed not on a textbook but on a page of intricate, swirling diagrams. He is not studying. He is invoking. The book before him is the Ars Notoria, the notary art, a forbidden grimoire that promised its users a treasure more valuable than gold, a perfect and instantaneous memory. Its method was a fusion of prayer and magic. A student would recite specific Latin orations while staring with intense concentration at complex geometric figures called noti. These were not simple illustrations. They were esoteric maps believed to channel angelic or planetary energies directly into the practitioner's mind. The promise was intoxicating: mastery of the entire university curriculum, grammar, rhetoric, law, philosophy, and theology, all without the decade of sleepless nights and painful discipline. Imagine the temptation for a young scholar from a poor family, watching wealthier classmates buy expensive books and pay for private tutors. Here was a secret key that could unlock every door of knowledge at once, a supernatural scholarship that leveled the playing field through sheer, forbidden power. The established church and university authorities saw this not as cleverness, but as a profound perversion. The sanctioned path to knowledge was the ars memoriae, the art of memory, a rigorous technique where scholars built elaborate mental palaces, placing ideas they wished to remember in specific rooms. This was a disciplined, laborious process, a form of mental and spiritual exercise that was seen as honoring God's gift of the intellect. The Ars Notoria, by contrast, was a demonic shortcut. It sought to bypass both human effort and divine grace, attempting to seize intellectual power through a ritual pact. This was not true learning, it was a form of spiritual theft. The authorities condemned it as a pact with demons, who were believed to supply the impossible memory in exchange for the user's soul. The text was banned and burned wherever it was found. This hunger for an easy path to enlightenment reveals a timeless human weakness, the desire to have the reward without the struggle. It stands in stark opposition to the final forbidden book, a text that offered no shortcuts at all, but instead demanded the absolute peak of human intellectual effort to even begin to understand its meaning. A pagan prophet was once believed to have foreseen the coming of Christ. The rediscovery of the Corpus Hermeticum in the 15th century sent a shockwave through the intellectual world of the Renaissance. These texts, attributed to the legendary Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus, were thought to be impossibly ancient, a sacred wisdom from the dawn of time that predated even Moses. For a scholar like Marsilio Ficino, receiving a command to translate these manuscripts before the works of Plato himself, it was an electrifying moment. He believed he was unsealing a Prisca Theologia, a pure, original theology given to humanity in a golden age, a divine philosophy that naturally harmonized with and even predicted the truths of Christianity. The Hermetica presented a universe alive with divine energy, where the human soul was not a humble sinner but a spark of the celestial fire, a microcosm mirroring the macrocosm of God's creation. It taught that through knowledge of the hidden sympathies binding the heavens and the earth, a human being could learn to manipulate the very forces of nature. This was not just philosophy, it was a manual for human divinity. A Renaissance magus in his study, surrounded by astrological charts and alchemical vessels, saw in these pages a sacred justification for his quest. He was not practicing forbidden magic, he was enacting a holy science, using his divine intellect to command the elements and draw down the power of the stars. He was fulfilling his God-given role as a co-creator of the world. This initial embrace, however, could not last. The very foundation of the Hermetica's authority was its antiquity. When scholars in the late 16th century began to apply new philological techniques, they made a devastating discovery. The language, the philosophical concepts, they all pointed to a much later date, not to the time of the pyramids, but to the early centuries after Christ. The texts were not a divine prophecy, but a product of the same syncretic, pagan world that early Christianity had struggled against. Overnight, the revered sage Hermes was transformed from a pre-Christian prophet into a post-Christian pagan. The Church's initial curiosity turned to deep suspicion. Here was a complete system of spiritual and natural power, a rival revelation that claimed the same authority as Scripture, but it came from a source now understood to be entirely outside the Christian tradition. The Hermetica provided the intellectual backbone for the entire Renaissance magical tradition, a tradition the Church was increasingly determined to suppress. Its fall from grace forces a profound question. If this ancient wisdom was a mirage, what other secret traditions were being passed hand to hand, preserving knowledge that the official world had deemed too dangerous to remember? The most dangerous library was the one that did not officially exist. Tucked away in a secluded tower of a castle or concealed behind a false wall in a nobleman's study, these collections held the contraband of the mind. Kings like Matthias Corvinus of Hungary and dukes like Federico da Montefeltro of Urbino amassed vast private libraries. but their most precious acquisitions were often the texts you would never find on a university reading list. Here, bound in unmarked leather, were manuscripts on judicial astrology, the forbidden chapters of alchemical texts, and the condemned theological works of thinkers like Marsilius of Padua. These collections were more than personal hobbies. They were fortresses for ideas under siege, where dangerous knowledge was granted asylum by the very powers that publicly upheld the established order. The act of copying these texts was a quiet rebellion. In a back room of a stationer's shop, a scribe would work by candlelight, his hand meticulously forming the letters of a banned book. He knew the risk. Discovery could mean the loss of his profession, excommunication, or worse. Each finished copy was a victory, a seed of a forbidden idea planted in another mind. This was a shadow economy of knowledge, a clandestine network connecting a brave scribe, a wealthy patron willing to finance the work, and a curious collector who would safeguard the result. These secret channels formed an underground river that kept the waters of intellectual inquiry flowing, even during the driest seasons of censorship. The sheer existence of these networks proves a profound truth, that the human hunger for knowledge is a force that cannot be fully contained by any authority. As these forbidden libraries grew, their accumulated weight of unsanctioned ideas created a pressure that was about to find its ultimate release in a revolutionary new technology. A new kind of machine began to whisper, and its voice was impossible to silence. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, invented around 1440, was not a forbidden text itself, but it became the greatest weapon against censorship the world had ever seen. Picture the first printed Bibles, page after identical page, rolling off the wooden contraption in Mainz. For centuries, a book was a unique artifact, its creation slow and its errors as individual as the scribe's handwriting. Now the press could produce hundreds of perfect copies from a single set of type, turning a fragile stream of knowledge into an unstoppable flood. The authorities who had so carefully policed the Scriptorium now faced an existential crisis. How do you burn every copy of a book when there are suddenly thousands of them scattered across a continent? The very economics of heresy had been overturned. The cost of a book plummeted, placing once unthinkable knowledge into the hands of merchants, lawyers, and artisans. A student could now own a personal copy of a classical text or a scientific treatise, studying it in private without a master looking over his shoulder. This was the true revolution, the democratization of information itself. The church and state scrambled to respond, creating elaborate systems of pre-publication, licensing, and expanding the index of prohibited books to terrifying length. But their efforts were like trying to hold back the ocean with a broom. For every banned book they seized, the press could produce 10 more in a hidden print shop across the border. The genie was not just out of the bottle, it had learned how to replicate itself. This technological leap transformed the battle over forbidden knowledge from a series of isolated skirmishes into a full-scale war of ideas, ensuring that the next great challenge to authority would be heard not in a single courtroom, but in every town square at once. The power to print a book was also the power to print a warrant for thousands of deaths. The Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches, stands as a chilling monument to a forbidden truth, that reason itself could be weaponized to serve a paranoid and brutal agenda. Published in 1487 by the German inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, this book was not a call for liberation but a detailed instruction manual for persecution. It twisted the tools of scholastic logic into a grotesque parody, using fabricated evidence and circular arguments to prove the reality of witchcraft. Its primary target, with a venomous focus that drips from every page, was women. The text argued with a terrifying, systematic coldness that women were inherently more susceptible to demonic influence, more carnal, and more deceitful than men. Imagine a village where a simple quarrel between neighbors or a failed crop could now be filtered through the lens of this book. A local midwife's knowledge of herbs, a reclusive old woman's strange habits. Any independent or unconventional woman could suddenly find herself accused. The Malleus provided the checklist, the questions to ask under torture, and the legal justifications for burning a human being alive. It gave terrified communities a script for their own cruelty, transforming fear into a self-perpetuating industry of death. The grim irony is that the book itself was initially condemned by the Church's own authorities. Many inquisitors were appalled by its illegal procedures and its obsessive, prurient focus on sexual details, which they saw as a corruption of their office. Yet, in the chaotic new world of print, its notoriety became its power. It spread faster than the official condemnations, becoming the de facto handbook for secular and religious witch hunters alike. The Malleus Maleficarum demonstrates a horrifying inversion of the forbidden book's usual role. It did not expand the boundaries of human reason, but violently contracted them. It showed that the printed word could be used not to free the mind, but to build a prison of dogma so absolute that it justified any atrocity. This dark counterpart to the age's intellectual revolutions forces a difficult question. How do we distinguish between a book that challenges power and one that empowers the worst in us? The final edition of the Index of Prohibited Books was published in 1948. A stark reminder that the machinery of censorship remained in official operation well into the modern era. This was not a relic that died with the Middle Ages. It was a living, evolving system that expanded its reach to include the foundational texts of the new science and the Enlightenment. The revolutionary work of Copernicus, arguing the Earth moved around the Sun, was placed on the Index, where it remained for over 2 centuries. Galileo's dialogues, which defended that very model, were condemned, and the aging scientist was forced to recant his findings on his knees. Think of the chilling effect this had, not just on astronomy, but on every field of inquiry. For generations, a scientist or philosopher across Catholic Europe had to work with a mental list of forbidden conclusions, a map of intellectual no-go zones. This legacy created a culture of caution where certain questions were inherently suspect and the most direct methods of inquiry carried a whiff of heresy. Yet this pressure did not destroy knowledge. It forced it to adapt to find new channels. The quest for forbidden truths moved into the private correspondence between intellectuals, a secret network of letters crisscrossing the continent. It found sanctuary in the meeting halls of secret societies and Masonic lodges, where new ideas could be debated away from the eyes of the authorities. The irony is profound. By branding a book as forbidden, the censors often guaranteed its fame. A work on the Index became a trophy, its possession a mark of intellectual courage. The very act of suppression created an aura of irresistible allure around these texts, ensuring they were sought after, copied in secret, and read with an intensity that a sanctioned book might never receive. The struggle over these forbidden pages, stretching from the medieval scriptorium to the dawn of the 20th century, did more than just preserve specific ideas. It forged a tradition of critical dissent, a habit of questioning authority that became a cornerstone of the modern mind. The flames of the book burning could consume paper and ink, but they only succeeded in scattering the seeds of thought on a stronger wind. The same fear that fueled medieval book burnings now drives content moderation algorithms. Our digital town squares are the new battlegrounds for controlling knowledge, where a post can be silenced as swiftly as a manuscript was once consigned to the flames. The vocabulary has changed. We now debate misinformation and cancel culture instead of heresy, but the core conflict is startlingly familiar. It is the age-old struggle between the desire for stability and the disruptive power of new ideas. A government today might block access to a website that challenges its authority, just as a medieval bishop would ban a text that questioned church doctrine. The underlying belief is identical, that certain information is too dangerous for public consumption, that it can corrupt minds and unravel the social fabric. This is the modern echo of the medieval censor's deepest anxiety. The same impulse that led to the index of prohibited books now manifests in complex terms of service and community guidelines, all designed to police the boundaries of acceptable discourse. We are still negotiating what constitutes dangerous knowledge and who gets to decide. The story of these forbidden medieval texts is not a closed chapter in a history book. It is an ongoing lesson in the vital importance of intellectual freedom. It reminds us that the right to question, to explore uncomfortable truths, and to challenge the established order is not a luxury. It is the very engine of human progress. The enduring legacy of these suppressed works is a clear and urgent message. The battle for the freedom of thought is never truly won. It is a frontier we must consciously choose to protect with every generation. From the Condemnation of 1277 to the secret libraries of Renaissance princes, we have walked a path lit by forbidden flames. These texts, whether challenging the cosmos or the soul, were united by a single, dangerous act. They trusted human reason to question the world. Their authors and readers risked everything not for rebellion's sake, but for a deeper truth, the conviction that the mind must be free to explore. The modern world of open inquiry was not born in the light, but forged in the shadows of censorship and fear. The historian Isaiah Berlin captured the eternal tension perfectly, noting that liberty for the wolves has often meant death to the sheep. This is the enduring dilemma of censorship, the struggle to balance the need for a stable society against the unstoppable human drive to know more. The story of these books is a testament to their power. A single volume can indeed alter the course of history. Let their legacy be a call to vigilance, a reminder to fiercely protect our right to read, to question, and to understand. Share in the comments a book that changed your own perspective, and subscribe to keep uncovering the hidden histories that built our world.